this is really one of my favorite topics, and specifically this panel, technology commercialization, and how do we accelerate that process. So just a real quick introduction of myself. ACCF is a think tank, been around for multiple decades, traditionally very focused on taxes and trade issues. We're free market oriented, nonpartisan, and just the last couple of years, we've waded into the waters of energy and the environment. We, for a brief time, had a George Dave Banks at ACCF, and then we lost him to the White House, and then he came back recently. And so with Dave's return to ACCF, with my presence there and a couple of other folks, we've now launched a Center for Energy Security and Climate Economics. There's some materials outside if you want to learn more about it, but fundamentally what we're looking to do is really create a space where free market conservative Republicans can find opportunity to support solutions that address climate change. With that, let me just introduce our panel, and then we'll get right into it. So to my far left here, we have Varun Rai.
Right.
Yes. Yes, to your right, to my left. He's going to keep me straight. So Varun is an associate professor at the LBJ School of Public Affairs, where he directs Energy Systems Transformation Research Group and is also in the Mechanical Engineering Department. He's published numerous journal articles, more than I can actually count, but many that you would know, scientific journals as well as op-eds and other writings in the Wall Street Journal, New York Times, and so forth. He was, interestingly, the commissioner for Austin Energy, which, as you may know, is a vertically integrated utility and has been very progressive in many ways around energy innovation. And so we look forward to hearing more about that, Varun. And then to my immediate right is Ellen Williams, where as many of us know her as having led the ARPA-E agency, but she also has a distinguished career prior to that, where she first earned her Bachelor of Sciences degree from Michigan State University and her PhD from California Institute of Technology. She founded the University of Maryland's Materials Research Science and Engineering Center, and has served as its director since 1996 through 2009, and also served as the chief scientist at BP. So there's a recurring theme here. We like to have former chief scientists from BP on our panels, and so I'm told that you did not overlap with Steve Koonin. Yeah. But anyway, that's another conversation. And as I mentioned, ARPA-E, really instrumental in her role there from 2014 to 2017. And then Johanna Wolfson in the center is principal at Prime Impact Fund, which uses philanthropic dollars to back breakthrough startups that use science-based innovations to address climate change. Previously, Johanna was the Technology to Market Director in the Office of Energy Efficiency and Renewable Energy at the Department of Energy. And so we have some commonality there with my background having been at DOE in that same role as well. And before joining EERE, Johanna was with the Fraunhofer Center for Sustainable Energy Systems in Boston. And I know Fraunhofer came up in one of the previous discussions, and so hope to hear more about that. She's also served as the president of the MIT Science Policy Initiative and has her PhD in physical chemistry from MIT. So just a few highlights from each of their backgrounds and experience. So with that, really this purpose of this panel is to focus on commercialization, as I mentioned, and bringing technology to market at speed and scale. And so this is a topic that I noted. Commercialization is one of my favorite subjects. Speed and scale is one of those phrases that I think we throw around quite a bit in this space. And so I really wanted to start the conversation, and forgive me for this being somewhat basic, but I know that Ellen will really bring illumination to this topic more specifically. We use speed and scale a lot, and so what I really want to know is, as we talk about that, what does that mean? Speed and scale for what? And whose speedometer and at what scale is really impactful? Knowing that these are really challenging technologies in terms of clean energy technologies. So if you could maybe just elicit that a little bit. I know you've got 3 slides. Yep. Feel free to dive into one or all 3 of them to set the stage for us.
Okay, great.
Thank you.
So let me talk a little bit about scale and innovation and the pathway to maturity in having scale. And this little illustration right here is basically your standard learning curve, which shows that a technology over time starts out either very expensive or not acting very well, and over time it matures and becomes competitive. And wind turbines right now are very much in a competitive space, but 20 years ago they were way up to the left on that curve. And frankly, there was a period of time when it wasn't clear whether wind was going to be economically viable or not. And that's very often the early stages of R&D, where we're doing this portfolio investment and really trying to push forward the cumulative advances that suddenly make it possible for a technology to take off and have that big impact. And so here's wind. It's now at the point where it is somewhat a disruptive technology, even for natural gas and coal-fired power. And there it sits, and it's going to continue to be better and better because there'll be continuing research and development, continuing operations improvements, continuing investments of all sorts that gradually and consistently drive down the cost of activity. In the meantime, at the early stage, let's see here, there we go. At the early stage, there may be competitors in the wings. And this particular competitor in the wing is one I know about. It's an airborne wind turbine by Makani. And this particular picture was about 8 years ago. It's a 6 kilowatt prototype, which they demonstrated they could fly, generate power down a tether, and they landed their demonstration, and they got bought by a deep pockets investor, Google. Now they're part of the Alphabet portfolio of Google, and they are moving fast. And we look at this early stage innovation. First of all, it was funded by ARPA-E to solve some very fundamental problems. And so I'll talk a little bit about this early stage that's designed to put technologies on a fast path towards scale. And so in the early stages of R&D, you'll have a technology that has problems, and you don't know yet whether those technology problems are going to be solvable and make it. So the early stage ARPA-E investment, a research and development investment across a whole range of portfolio of technologies, in this case for Makani, was used to solve a problem of controls. How can you fly your wind turbine up in the air and both maintain a constant trajectory and take this variable wind speed and turn it into power and send it down its tether? And the incremental funding from ARPA-E helped them solve that technological problem and demonstrate that early stage prototype that this had feasibility. And then the process of having a deep pockets investor was really important for this next stage of really driving the thing up to scale. And so, in the early stages, when ARPA-E was funding this project, it wasn't clear, and it actually to some extent still isn't clear, whether this project actually was going to have feet. By the time you were done with ARPA-E, it was pretty clear that this project had feet, but it wasn't clear what the innovation pathway was going to really end up with on the pathway to speed and scale. And so what curve will this new technology follow? Will it develop new niche markets that just happen to fit in places where standard wind can't play? Or is it actually going to turn out to be that it's so economical and so much better than wind that it's going to drive down and become competitive? We still don't know the answer to that question. It's possible that it might go down and become a disrupted learning curve, and it's possible that it might not. And Makani is not the only airborne wind turbine in the market. There's several competitors even in that space. And in the meantime, wind and offshore wind are continuing to develop and drive down their costs. So it's a very dynamic process. And there's a fair amount of luck and serendipity in that beginning stage where you've got the right technology all the different parts align. You're able to find the suppliers, the distributors, the people who have the know-how, and pull it together to make a winning technology. So it's a very interesting process, and one of which in the early stage requires a lot of discipline. And so the ARPA-E model in that early stage really involves taking people with innovative ideas and not only supporting their technology, but giving them some training and some focus on understanding the techno-economics of what they're doing. Are they going to be commercializable? What does it take to be competitive? And then positioning them to move forward to the next stage of attracting a private sector investor. And I said I'd show you some success statistics, so let me just do that. So ARPA-E is a young agency. It's only been in place for about 8 years since it started funding projects. So it's early days yet to say that any of the technologies have gone out and created a huge market, but we're measuring intermediate metrics of success. And one of the metrics of success that's been quite potent for ARPA-E is looking at its project teams and how many of them have actually got themselves to the stage where they're able to go out and attract private sector funding. And so this graph shows the light blue bars, the cumulative number of firms that have attracted private sector funding. And at this point, at the end of last year, ARPA-E projects had attracted more than $2.6 billion in private sector follow-on funding. Without that private sector follow-on funding, there's no hope that any technology will grow and have an impact. Other projects, the yellow bars, which for some reason don't have a label, are projects that were able to go out and attract government funding to continue developing their projects. The dark blue bars started new companies. About 10% of ARPA-E's projects actually fail. They don't meet their technical milestones, and they get canceled, and the money comes back to the agency. And another 40% don't show up in this chart, and they have grown knowledge, developed knowledge, and contributed to the field. So we don't call them failures. So what I would say overall is that in terms of the pathway to innovation and impact, speed and impact, we first all need thousands of innovations. There's the big picture. I need a big power generation that's clean. And then there's a small picture, thousands of innovations from materials discovery through all sorts of areas of science that need to come together to make that possible. And not only do we need those innovations, but we need to be very, very conscious about how we put them together and understand how they might come together to make a useful project. And then we need, in addition to government engagement, really knowledgeable domain expert investors, as we heard earlier, who can evaluate what's out there and continue to give that guidance and structure to those young companies for them to move forward in the market.
That's good. Ellen, I want to come back to that at one point, but maybe give Johanna a chance to chime in on how you guys think about speed and scale.
Yeah, so I would think about speed and scale on an additional level. If we think about Ellen's example of Makani as a new technology, how can it achieve scale? How can it do so with some quickness? Then I wonder if we could also think about speed and scale on kind of a meta level. So if in that case, scale would be how do we design an R&D system with very high throughput? So that those thousands of points of light, I love that expression, right, have a higher yield than what we see today. And then speed maybe is how do we design an R&D system where things can move through more quickly. And fundamentally, when we're talking about hardware-based innovation, I think there is definitely a limit to how quickly things can move. These things take a long time. But what we have today is not a system that steadily moves things through. It's a system where things get stuck because we have all sorts of financing gaps and so on. So on the high throughput, on scale, I think we need to look at kind of handoff points. And anyone who is in the privileged position of being able to shepherd dollars, whether they are in a government agency or in a state economic development organization or a venture capital firm or something else, to be very, very conscious and always designing for the handoff point. And even within the Department of Energy, it was shocking to me how little that happens in terms of the very upstream R&D at the Office of Science being handed off in an intentional way or in a guided way to an ARPA-E or to an another applied office that was at EERE. And that applies to me as a very early stage investor looking to support companies, say, coming out of RPE, but then being able to hand them off to a project financier or a later stage investor. And so I think opportunities to do that as an intentional design would be much needed, especially in government. And then on the speed point and how do you design around getting things unstuck, so I think there are multiple financing gaps that deserve attention. The one I work at the Prime Impact Fund is at the earliest stages of company formation. So funding a company that is just nascent out of a lab or is brand new, doesn't have any institutional capital yet. And we bring in capital that is purely philanthropic, so it has no specific return need, which is really unique in the investment space. And then we seek to get them to a point of venture capital financing. But there are many other places where this type of capital could be tremendously important and to unstick things. We heard about the challenge of financing first projects earlier, and that's an example of a very common challenge that companies run into, or financing, a first production run. If you're a hardware-based company, then you need to finance the production run of your product before you have revenue, but it's hard to qualify for credit before you have revenue, right? So there are many things like that where new types of capital can play a role, and I think that's very promising and ultimately will come to bear, but it's very early.
Yeah, thank you for that. And I have some experience in sort of that conundrum of being a CEO of a startup company. Powerfield Energy is a solar simple company, and often you go to market, go to the investors seeking capital, right? And they say, great idea. Yeah. Come back to us when you've got $500,000 in revenue.
Yeah, great idea. Someone else should fund it.
Right. And then you're like, well, wait, if I had $500,000 in revenue, I'm not sure that I would be coming to you, or maybe I'd be asking for a lot more money. But it's a challenge for sure at that early stage. Varun, you've done a lot of research on speed and scale, and you know it also at the very local level. So I'm kind of curious, from your perspective and thinking about, municipalities like Austin Energy, how do you guys think about, when you were there, speed and scale, given that the energy complex is so complex? I mean, we're talking different technologies, we're talking different power sources, we're talking different uses, and we're talking different constituencies, and then you got federal, state, local. So how do you think about speed and scale?
Great. I would first like to take a step back and talk about speed and scale from a different perspective. When Michael showed his slides in the first panel, he showed the emissions trajectories and what we need to be doing from a global perspective, right? We're looking at trajectories, 1.5 degrees Celsius or 2 degrees Celsius limits where we have to peak in emissions in the next decade or so, and then be zero in the next 3 decades or so, and potentially go negative. So that's one way of thinking about the speed of it. We're looking at transitions, massive transitions of the global energy system in 10 to 30 years. Typically, any big part of the energy system changes at decadal scale, right? And here we're talking about changing all of that altogether in 10 to 30, 50 years, right? So that's one. On speed. On scale, just an example, in the next 30 years, China will be adding electricity that is equal the current US stock. India will be adding electricity that is equal the EU stock, just new additions in the next 3 decades. So that's kind of a sense of scale of what we are going to deal with. I'll quickly connect back to a couple points that Ellen and Johanna mentioned in terms of hardware, scaling that up, but then to Ellen's point on technology, cost curves, and so on. Some very interesting things that I discovered when I started working in this area a few years ago, around 2008 to 2010, when I was working a lot on CCS, is when it comes to complex technologies, big physical hardware technologies, and the type of transition we are talking about actually entails a lot of that. Nuclear, CCS, those are good examples. They actually don't scale very well as you scale them up in terms of cost reduction. So one of my biggest surprises was when you actually don't go systematically about how you build in stages. The history of nuclear in the US in the 70s shows that. The history of how LNG started and kept on for 30, 40 years starting with Japan and UAE and so on. History of SO2 scrubbers was more positive, but in general, when you're talking about technologies that we're dealing with, cost reductions as you scale up is actually not automatic. In fact, history tells us you might go the opposite way if you don't do it very well. So lesson number one for me is, from my studies, is one has to be going back to Johanna's point, very, very intentional about those handoff points. As you're scaling up, Dan Nocera also mentioned in his comments early on that he did the pilot and then handed it off to the private sector. In the energy area, it's still out there in terms of what those processes are. Once you're funding a range of different innovations, but once you start taking them out to the field, what is that staged process? There is no uniformity. Pharma drug has come a lot in the focus. There are similarities and dissimilarities. One similarity is, yes, these both take time, both involve regulatory risk, both are capital intensive. One thing that does work positively for pharma is that there is the FDA approval process, which, of course, there are positive and negative results. But the thing is, with every different stage, there is more clarity on the technical potential of the trial or the drug. But then there is also concomitant more regulatory certainty. And by the time you're through with that process, you know it works from the context. We don't have anything like that for energy. I'm not saying it's easy. It's actually much harder because the energy space is much more diverse and so on. But that's a very critical bottleneck. There were CCS demonstration projects that were mentioned, large, hundreds of billions of dollars that have happened in the US, in Canada, EU. Multiple of them have been canceled, generated good information, but were there really good uses of resources just going from what you had to building it all up? See, I'll condition that by saying that some of my own writing and work I have suggested we have 10 years to 30 years timeline. Starting and building early is going to be super important. You do the models, depending on how much your experience you're able to generate in the early years matters a lot in terms of what you're able to achieve in terms of emissions in the next 2-3 decades. That doesn't mean you will do it wrong, right? You do have to have a very serious process of building in the learning cycles between the generations of the technology. So that's one. I'll make another comment, keep it short, and then we can come back, is once we think about deploying technologies at scale, it hits the ground, right? Where do you deploy these technologies? In communities, in states, in regions, right? We don't deploy them up there. So that's where you start interacting with variations in terms of local conditions. So, weather conditions. You interact with differences in customer preferences, community choices, local regulations and policies, right? Local opportunities and technological capabilities, right? And so one of the key things is that as you think about scaling up, it's very important to find accepting markets that are willing to take these technologies on, work through the innovation cycle, be able to invest, see that as a strategic part of their own community and regional development. I think this is super important. I'll just throw out 3 examples and then come back later on for more details. CCS is a good example. CCS, for example, why is China very important for CCS? Well, much of the coal build has happened and is going to happen there in China. It's not a matter of IP or anything. It's like any learning that you can potentially really have at scale has to happen there because that's where it is going to get built. There is no learning. So companies are having to work and strategize, say, let's try to work there, right? So that's one. Second example, shale gas. We heard on the last panel early on also in terms of shale. The technologies are there for all communities, but there are only some communities that really have benefited, right? They were ready from a regulatory perspective, from a market structure perspective, and so on. Not to say other communities should also jump the boat. No, I'm just highlighting the differences in local conditions and how they really matter to what gets deployed and where. And the third one, which I'm sure I'll have opportunity to come back later on, is solar. And I'll put out the example of California Solar Initiative, which was a program from 2016, 2010, $2 billion, state-level program for deploying solar in the state. It really gave we talked about policy certainty. It was one of those programs that had clear certainty from beginning. It was very transparent. There was a lot of market information, led to good competition through installers. There are companies that did very well. There was business model variation, and so that's an example of how local, regional actors can actually come, and then California did not, for that matter, come out with all the innovations and so on. They were really leveraging all that had happened in Japan and Germany in the years and the decades before, but they saw both the opportunity, the need from the community's perspective, and then came out with something that was very, very clear and certain. They did very well. In fact, they may have done too well, and so now they're going to have to think about storage, and so that's their next. We can come back to that.
Yeah.
But my point here was the accepting markets that are able to work with and tie to their local interest and plans is actually going to be very important.
Yeah, I think that's critical, and honestly, it's hard as an inventor, and having met and worked with a number of inventors, right, is you sort of fall in love with your technology and can so easily forget the market and how critical that is of finding kind of the path of least resistance there. So I guess one just quick question last on speed. I mean, is it misleading for us to talk about speed in the context of energy scale up? I mean, given that hardware just takes decades in many cases, software, is very different. But I mean, should we change our vernacular in terms of speed and scale? Or, again, is it misleading? Are we setting expectations that can't possibly be achieved?
I think one element of scale and related to speed has to do with the nature of incumbency. So if you're coming up against an incumbent industry and having to replace existing facilities with new ones, then you really do have a huge speed barrier. So we see that while renewable energy, wind and solar, is growing very, very fast, it's growing from a small base, and it is struggling to claim a large amount of market share because at a certain point, other parts of the market have to start to decrease. And so that's a part of the growth of a new technology that in some sense has to be taken into account with your planning, but it's not under the control of the technology development. But in other areas where you're developing something that is really quite new for the market, for instance, grid-scale energy storage, I think we can expect to see grid-scale energy storage grow at great speed to large scale because it's addressing a new need that there isn't an incumbent that needs to be displaced. So you'd really have to take those differences into account. This decades-long idea of developing a technology is only true in the context of how fast the market wants that technology. We've seen transitions happen very fast in the market that involve big hardware issues when the product itself is really attractive and it's filling a need that isn't otherwise filled.
Yeah, I think that's a good point. Any other further comment on that?
Yeah, I think that's a great point. And with the market, the fact that the market can move quickly and then pull aside, I think in the absence of that, I would generally agree with your statement, Drew, that these technologies will take longer. Yes, I think there are efficiencies to be gained by better integrating in with strategics or by building incubator programs that there's shared hardware. These kinds of there are efficiencies to be gained, but I don't think there's a fundamental change in how long it will take to build these businesses. That said, there are technologies that can be supported now. Strategically de-risked over the course of a couple years and install a first project, I think in time for the next infrastructure cycle or two, to Varun's point about the kind of slow-moving nature cadence of this industry.
Yeah. Good. Is there? I mean, I guess talk about the differences. And is there one between sort of a technology in this clean energy space coming from a garage to the market versus a lab to the market? I mean, is there a difference in terms of speed and scale? In some cases, the technology actually goes from garage to lab to market. And maybe any examples that you've seen from your experience. I don't know, maybe Johanna, can I point to you first in the way that you guys think about this?
So I'm not sure we see a lot direct from a garage, right? Most of the companies that we support or projects we support are coming out of the university setting, and where there's, all you can do is pattern match, right? And say, here, this is what I've seen look successful. But oftentimes what that looks like is, a breakthrough innovation in a university lab that's then, kind of captures the heart and mind and spirit of, someone willing to go out and throw their life into making a company around this thing. And that's a bold, audacious thing to do, and it's not for everyone. And it's very hard to kind of forcefully extract something if you don't have that kind of human spirit behind it. So that's a common pattern that we've seen. Because you mentioned labs, I will say that in the context of national labs, that's a real challenge. There are efforts, I worked on some of them at the Department of Energy to better support scientists at national labs with preparing technologies for spin-out. But in my opinion, it doesn't happen nearly at the rate that we might want to expect from a $12 billion annual investment. And so, and I can speak to the fact that as an investor, I see almost nothing, coming from out of the national labs. So it's usually, university supported by NSF, ARPA-E, EERE. Those are the common types of entities that we see. And of course, as you pointed out, there can be different paths to that point in terms of is it a sole inventor or out of a university lab. Another interesting archetype that comes out, I think, is an industry veteran who actually knows this sector really well, and maybe spent time, in a GE or a Honeywell or something, and is taking that industry expertise and can build a business around it in a way that you don't necessarily see in the software sector.
Yeah. And Varun, from your perspective, again, municipalities, specifically Austin Energy, is a great proving ground in many ways, right? How do they think about, and how do you sort of think about in this analysis, the intersection between, entrepreneurs, startups, and early stage technologies, and the utilities' willingness to help serve as a proving ground for those? Does that sort of fit into their DNA?
Great question. I'll first add something to the lab to market or garage to market. I think, Ellen made a comment earlier, which is a body of knowledge that is associated with any of these. When we're talking about the scale and speed that is needed, we need technologies that can make a big difference and can go out there quickly. They are more disruptive in nature, at least, key parts of that. And those typically will involve really understanding what the broader area, be it battery or storage or whatever, has to offer, and that will more likely than not kind of go back to an academic setting, university. So I kind of echo that thought. To your question on municipalities or utilities more generally being more or less accepting, I think that's where, again, going back to Ellen's point, market structure, incumbency become very important. Austin Energy has been very progressive, and for that matter, I can extrapolate that to a state level, and there are a few states, California certainly stand out. They are progressive, but partly, this is bottom up. This is what the people actually want and support in those places, right? So being on the commission and the commission hearings, all the investments and ideas flowing through the commission. My biggest lesson was not about what was being funded or not, but the biggest lesson was how the community is always at the table, kind of voicing what's important for the future of the community, right? When you have that, that's what flows through what the commissions or utilities do. It's I don't think there is anything in the DNA of the commissions per se. It's actually DNA of the communities that matter.
Thank you for that. Yeah, and I suspect that BP and ARPA-E think very hard about this question of technology commercialization and how do we accelerate that path. They both play distinct roles.
Right.
Maybe talk about how those roles are different between ARPA-E and BP.
Yeah. So, well, in the BP sense, there's BP Ventures, which is a very strongly domain expert guided venture investment fund, and we've heard about how important that is in venture. And then there's BP R&D internal, which is very much focused on identifying potential R&D programs that will have a very clear, well-defined impact on the business. And so they tend to be, especially, both of them are very focused on what's called materiality. Does this project have the potential to grow to a scale big enough that it matters to a company the size of BP? And that's a very big hurdle. At ARPA-E funds projects that can grow to a variety of different scales, and also that are at a variety of different states of initial development. And I was thinking about your question about universities versus garages versus small companies. And I think there is a very real process that takes place, as Johanna mentioned, that at a certain point, if someone doesn't jump out of the research environment, out of the university environment, or isn't ready to jump out of the national laboratory environment and start a company, it probably indicates that their technology is not mature enough yet. And when I showed the success metrics from ARPA-E, those projects that were attracting follow-on funding were the ones that had made that jump. The vast majority of our small companies that have said, okay, we are ready to make that commitment, and we think our technology is at the point that we can put it forward. And other technologies that are just earlier stage and not yet on that clear development process probably would be a mistake to push them to commercialize or start commercializing too soon.
Yeah, I think that's a great point, Ellen. And I think it was mentioned earlier today that for a really successful company, right, you need a team, you need a technology, and you need capital.
Yeah.
Are there good examples in the marketplace that you guys see that really accentuate, incentivizing the teams to take that risk? Maybe Prime is actually one of them, right? So, but are there others, or maybe how do you guys think about sort of attracting entrepreneurs to a space that is really challenging, takes a lot of scale, isn't as fast as we'd like it to, right? I mean, it's a risk. It's a big risk.
That's certainly part of Prime's goal, is to be the type of capital that can very uniquely fund something that is just forming as a company. Very few venture investors are in a position to do that, not really because of anything wrong with the venture model, just because the venture model works very well for what it does, which is not that. It's identifying a company with a 7-year path to 10x exit, and the companies we're talking about are not going to fit that mold most of the time. So we are certainly looking to do exactly that, and I think long term at scale, again, thousand points of light. How do we bring that to fruition? There needs to be more capital than a few funds at the table to send that message that this is a good place to spin a company out into. A program that probably many people in the audience are familiar with that does this well is Cyclotron Road. This is why it exists. It basically says if you're a hardcore, scientist, engineer with a breakthrough idea, there is no place that you can go to formulate that into something that could become a business. It's not at a big company. You don't have the autonomy. You don't have the ability to really design something breakthrough. It's not in a startup because it's too early for a startup. And it's not in academia because academia is focused on publications and not on building companies. And so that program, and there are now some other models percolating around that, is all about this and forming basically that platform for scientists to learn how to become entrepreneurs.
Great. Yeah, and I know Gates Ventures is another organization that presented earlier, and there are some good examples. So I'd say there's certainly more than there has been in the past, right? But I think we want more.
Yeah, exactly.
So can I ask, and I don't know if we're able to pull up the slide, but on Ellen, your 1,000 points of light slide.
Yeah.
Just a little bit of a discussion clarification here, and then I'd like each of your perspective on this. If one were potentially on Capitol Hill, maybe coming from the Republican side of the aisle, there could be a tendency to read this and think, all right, let 1,000 flowers bloom, which means also to just spread the peanut butter wide in terms of funding.
Yeah.
So can you just talk about how this might be different from that?
Yeah. So I'll give one example. There's an ARPA-E program which just kicked off last year. ARPA's funded a lot of energy storage activity, a lot of electrochemistry, batteries, fuel cells. And ARPA has a program which is a very focused materials discovery program because in the process of looking at energy storage and trying to advance those technologies, it became very clear that the membrane separators in electrolytic cells are a huge barrier. They have to be strong, they have to have high conductivity, they have to have high selectivity. And a breakthrough in that materials area could profoundly change the pathway of what we want to accomplish in energy storage. So I would say innovation in materials discovery, and maybe the key words there is innovations, and maybe I should have said development of innovations, because the whole point here is that you look at your topics of research and development. Now I'm talking not fundamental research, which I don't want to downplay in any way, but if you're thinking about innovation and commercialization, you have to think about your expertise, what's important and needs to be funded, and really focus on driving that forward. And so ARPA would pick 15 projects in that space, as they did, and push all of them very hard, and some of them would be more ready for commercialization, and some of them would still be at very early stages of R&D. And so your point is very well taken that this needs to be very carefully worded and reframed to make it very clear that this is not the basic research we need to fund, a lot of curiosity-driven research, but we really need to fund specific, focused increments of investment that drive us forward in areas that we know are important to help a technology move forward.
That's great. Thank you for that clarification. Any further comment? No?
Yeah, I to your spread the peanut butter question, look, I think anyone who says we need more budget for R&D is doing R&D a disservice if they do not couple with and we need to be smarter about how we spend our R&D dollars.
Yes.
And because if all that gets asked for is more funds,
yeah.
I mean, crying wolf. So I think that there are tons of things we could do smarter about our R&D projects, about management, in terms of incorporating industry feedback, in terms of killing projects, in terms of that handoff that we were talking about earlier. And everyone loves ARPA-E, and I love ARPA-E, but ARPA-E is a small part of DOE's budget. And so it's great that they do such a great job of managing projects and winnowing them down. But if we're looking at where's the rest of the $10 billion R&D budget going, and is it managed in that same way? No, it's definitely not. And so, I don't see a path where just continuing to raise the budget and spreading that peanut butter is actually a good thing for the R&D enterprise as a whole, unless we figure out how to be smarter about it and increase that yield coming through.
Yeah, that's good. And I think it touches on some discussions earlier around this very hard, almost impossible, but certainly worthwhile challenge of trying to figure out what is the return on investment and where can you most have an impact. And so along those lines, did you want to chime in?
Yeah, I'll just add one point to a little bit of the discussion that happened a few minutes ago on funding models and time scale and so on. Where the conventional VC model, that's just not what they do. In the sense of like 1,000 points of light bloom, it's also about different types of business models and how the whole space gets funded. What Prime is doing is a great example. My colleague at Stanford, Ashby Monk, talks about sovereign wealth funds. All right, there are lots of issues of lots of work that may need to be done, will need to be done, if at all that set of actors were to become more active. But talk about scale, and that's where the trillions of dollars exist, right? So that problem perhaps is taken care of. Time scale, they don't think 5-7 years. They think decades in terms of when they're looking for resources. The issues are more in terms of manpower, thought process, skill sets, and so on and so forth, right? So there are these other possibilities where there's some interesting thinking going on as to how do you, as you spend more R&D and do it more smartly, well, you do still have to kind of scale it all up, take it through that stage-gated process of risk reduction over different scales that will involve funding by VC substitute, what are those models? Prime is playing that role, and there are other possibilities. So that's another of those where you need some variation experimentation in terms of even what these models are.
Is there, maybe to you, Varun, first, we talked about sort of the complex nature of our regulatory structure. I think it was mentioned earlier today that the point that we are not China, right? Our democracy, our political system is very different, and sometimes, for worse, we can't, but mostly I would say for better. But in terms of being able to quickly make investments and achieve speed and scale on some of these areas that we know are critically important for addressing climate change, how would you describe the U.S.'s energy innovation policy? And do we have sort of a coherent one? And if we could have a better one, what might that look like?
Why do you want me to go on record saying something? Because
you're at the LBJ School of Public Policy.
No, I'm just joking. But I'll answer the question differently, which is, take the example of CCS and CCS projects that we have done, and there are a couple of really glaring examples of you started with a budget of $2 billion, ended up $7 billion, or $1 billion and ended up spending $3 billion, all rate based and so on. Lots of great lessons learned, but I'm not ready to say that's a done story, and that we should pack our bags and not focus on those technologies. No, why? These are projects that were built at scale, so hundreds of megawatts, right? So serious projects. A lot of the time, effort, money is actually in large-scale engineering, design, construction, operations, and so on. Mm-hmm. That's something where we have an issue here in the U.S. That's where if China were to do these projects, and they have done some of those, they're actually building a lot of nuclear. It's a whole different story, right? So we need to take that into account in terms of whatever we are learning from those projects that we have tried to build in this environment. Is that the cost? My answer to that is no. I'll add another thought later on, but it's really where you can do this demonstration, what those pieces of the costs are, and which actors may have the experience in building the global experience curve for that matter. All right. The other point I was going to say is also on CCS, whether it is gasification or post-combustion, and if we go by the couple of really glaring examples that we have had on the negative side, that would mean that let's stop gasification and do post-combustion. Here are the other things. Imagine scaling. Again, my main point is the jury is still out, and we need to be doing a lot of work on all the possibilities. Here's the reason. If you imagine scaling up post-combustion capture in China and India, and I'll take those as examples because they are going to be the primary demand centers. Third, more water. Third, more coal production. Rail infrastructure, it's all bottlenecked today. You can't add 30% in these countries in 3 important infrastructure dimensions, just not possible. Okay, so my point is you can't really be greatly successful in post-combustion and actually deploy these. I'm not even talked about geology and how they map up to actual sites and so on, right? Yeah. So that's the other reason why we have to be careful in terms of extrapolating what we're learning from projects where we build. There's a lot of contextual factors which are actually adding up to what we may be learning from these projects.
So a couple of takeaways that I heard from that, if I heard properly, was so one is while some countries like China and India, for instance, have an advantage of population and increasing demand far beyond what exceeds our demand in the future, and lower regulatory barriers, right, and the ability for the government to simply sort of dictate things. It sounds like their challenges remain in terms of the infrastructure is not sort of matching with the ability even for the technology to scale.
Yes.
Is that sort of a fair assessment?
Right.
Yeah.
They're strained to begin with in terms of what infrastructure they're dealing with, and then say, okay, let's put this technology at scale, which requires you to increase everything by 30%. I mean, that doesn't gel well with the domestic process. Yeah. And the operational ability.
Johanna, any thoughts on our national energy innovation policy strategy? Do we have one? Should we have one? What might it look like?
I don't think we've got much of one. I think there are glimmers of wonderful things happening. We've talked about many of them, but I don't think it's super cohesive.
Wait, sorry, say it again?
Not super cohesive.
Oh, okay, all right.
I think that the extent to which we have an energy innovation policy tends to be about R&D. I get why. I think that's fine. That's what's politically kind of comfortable and palatable. So if we're talking about R&D as an innovation policy, as I said, I think it's deeply flawed that we tend to talk about it on a single dimension, i.e. what is the absolute numbers in the budget. And there's work to be done there. And then a second dimension across which that's really flawed right now is that the Department of Energy, for instance, is not organized in a way that is kind of representative of how our energy system works. I mean, we've got kind of these siloed centers that don't interact with each other that well. We don't storage, the all important topic of storage research doesn't have kind of a center of excellence within the Department of Energy. It's spread across many different places, and I wouldn't know how to quantify the ways that that's holding us back, but I feel very sure that it is.
Maybe somebody from CRS could do that for us.
That sounds great. I really like the point, though, about the kind of locked-in technology innovation as it relates to existing infrastructure, and I wonder if there's more that could be done there. I think of the recent ARPA-E program, Meitner, that was put out, which is very much about supporting early-stage R&D, but in service of kind of system integration. This is for nuclear plants and reducing the overnight construction costs and that kind of thing. I thought it was a really innovative spin on what ARPA-E has become good at, which is supporting really breakthrough technologies in a single thrust area. But this was with a very systems, construction, balance of systems framework that I hadn't seen before. So I thought that might be an interesting example to run down.
Yeah, good, thank you. Ellen, any thoughts on the?
Yeah, so I think we have to, when we talk about government policy and energy innovation, we have to be a little bit careful. Again, there's these different stages of driving innovation through to commercialization. And some of them are more amenable to management than others. We heard, discussion about the DARPA model earlier, and a certain aspect of innovation is that there's a little bit of serendipity there, and if you try to plan it out too rigorously top down from the beginning, you might kill it. And DARPA has been successful because they've been allowed to go out and just really explore things that are far out. I think you have to have some element of that in the system where there's not too much top-down management trying to put everything into a box, but you also have to have some big picture strategic goals of where you want to go and where you would like to be. And once the technology is moving forward, really some planning, policy, and organization to roadmap it through to success. And we've seen a lot of really cool things happen. 40 years of DOE support of wind, of solar, the big truck energy efficiency program has been a huge success. So there are really examples where the government investment can drive great value through in that later stage of growing a technology to scale.
Good, so not a top-down plan, but a strategy would be helpful.
Yes, yeah.
Is there anything, so let's say we had a national energy innovation strategy.
Yeah.
I mean, so often in this commercialization space, you hear the valley of death, right? And many people, including myself, have lived it, and it's really that stage after which the technology has become real, but far before it's actually been, taken up in the market, right? Yeah. And sometimes there's multiple valleys of death, and sometimes they're deeper than others. But, I mean, is there anything that you can think of that would accelerate or maybe compress that valley of death that would be a good public policy way to think about solving that? I mean, we're not going to solve it, but can you accelerate it? Can you make it smaller? Can you make it less deep, right?
I think programs that allow technologies to demonstrate their capability, so you put up a test site and let a bunch of technologies come in and compete, or not necessarily compete, but work against metrics that the industry cares about. Those are tremendously helpful in getting small companies to the point where they can go out to the world and say, look, we have met these metrics, we've demonstrated them in a rigorous independent testing facility, and you can trust that this is going to work. Programs that allow or that support a small company in the early stages to participate in a field test, a demonstration that their technology will work in the field under working conditions, and that often involves getting some industrial partner to be willing to let them come in and put their technology up, hugely valuable. The military has been a great test bed for lots of young energy technologies. So things like that, where you give a company an opportunity to show that their technology can actually work, are really helpful in then giving investors the confidence that they can come in and make that next stage of investment.
Good. Any other thoughts?
Yeah, I echo the point about the industry involvement, and I think if there's ways to incorporate customer pull into a government funding decision, that's very powerful, right? Because that's an industry player. They're not yet opening their wallet, but they are saying, I would buy this if, or I would be interested if, and then government, could fund that. And it's, I think that there are ways to do it. There are obviously limitations to what government can do on behalf of any one private sector player, but I think there are ways to do that, and would shorten the path to market for some of these companies.
Good. Varun, any thoughts? Or otherwise, I have a question for you. But
No, I will add a thought, which is I'll invert the valley of death and frame this as a chemical reaction where you have an activation energy, right? So you can think of the valley of death as an activation energy, and the ideas that we heard will lower the activation energy for some. So what is the reaction rate for any reaction depends on the activation energy and how many molecules or reactants you have. So the other point is actually Ellen's point, the 1,000 points of light. You also need to increase the number of molecules, the ideas, and the number of companies and so on. Ties back to the bigger theme at this conference. Let's get more R&D money. What will you do with that? Fund those ideas. So you have more molecules, lower the activation energy, you'll see more of these molecules ending up on the other side.
So last question before we probably have to go to audience Q&A. So prepare your questions now, please. So along those lines, the way that we often talk about research and the way that Congress funds research is kind of in two buckets, basic and applied. And I see you're shaking your head. Yeah. So and we didn't talk about this ahead of time, but I have my own thoughts on this, and sort of the short of it is those don't feel like they're relevant constructs anymore for the way that innovation actually happens. But I'd love your perspective on that, and and are there ways, going back, Johanna, to your point, I think you sort of touched on this idea of maybe rethinking the way that research is done and managed at DOE. It sounds like there's opportunity there for sort of more cross-cutting collaboration on things like storage. But anyway, back to my question of does basic and applied still relevant in today's research world? And how ought we think about it differently, if so?
I think there's huge space for curiosity-driven research, really exploring new areas, and that just has to go on, and it continues to go on. NSF and Office of Science fund that type of research, doing it in the context of where is there out there in the physical science space things to explore that might generate long-term benefits that we can't quite understand now. That has to continue. The boundary then of when innovations come out of that work, what happens to them? I think what happens when you have a really innovative idea and it's going to move on to a pathway to see if it can develop into something that's useful, that's actually not applied research as it's typically defined. Typically, applied research is defined in a top-down fashion from there's an existing industry and they know what needs to be done to make their products better. And very often that's where applied research falls. Nothing wrong with that, it's very important, but there is this other area in there, which is that innovative ideas that have to be advanced, that's not quite applied research either.
Yeah, I don't think it serves us to, overmake that distinction. I think it's almost always artificial. Every basic science professor knows that trick where to get your research funded, you write a paragraph at the beginning of the grant proposal about all the great applications. Doesn't matter how far down the road it is. It's like most of these constructs end up being artificial, and in ways like the storage example I gave, but others as well. It's hard to see what it benefits. I think the reason it is that way, just to state the unstated, is that the basic research tends to be more protected. Right, it's less sensitive to political winds because it's kind of safely behind, far to the side of what would be considered the commercialization boundary, which is where interesting conversations percolate around the role of government. But besides that, I'm not sure the reason we have it.
And sometimes in my most cynical moments, I think that the political definition of basic research is research that's so early stage that it couldn't possibly interfere with or disrupt any incumbent player.
Yeah.
Right.
And so it's safe to support basic research.
So we're now at time where we need to take a few questions. And so we've got one right here in the front. Do we have a mic for him?
So I would actually like to push you on that very last point. So we do have an example of how a research area was completely restructured in terms of basic and applied research. And that's what happened at NIH as a result of Nixon's war on cancer, which basically led to NIH being completely restructured according to disease, right? And if you talk to biochemists, for example, they tend to react very negatively to this because the kinds of things that Ellen talked about, which is just blue sky research where you don't write a paragraph at the beginning of the proposal explaining that has some relevance, but you actually, the first paragraph says we want to understand something, right? That gets lost. So I'm just curious whether we're risking in this conversation going the NCI-NIH route in the energy field, where the focus is too much on we're going to organize things according to, for example, storage technologies. We're going to energy transport, all these kinds of things. So I'm just curious about the thoughts of the panel on that.
Yeah, I take the point. It's there's definitely a risk of that. I think we are pretty far on the other side. When I think about the size of the institution of the national labs, wonderful basic science equipment. There's a lot of. Some might argue there's not as much independence as might be required for true curiosity-driven research. I think that might be right. I think, I go back to Varun's point about the timing and part of the theme of today, and if we could shift the balance a little bit toward, with an eye toward deploying targeted products in 15 years, I think that would be timely and critical.
Yeah, and I would agree. I would be very hesitant to reorganize DOE and say we need a energy storage department function within DOE, because you'd like to have this be much more fluid and able to adapt to the needs at the time. On the other hand, you do have to have some kind of organizational structures.
Yeah, so it sounds like maybe there's a balance to be struck there between the current silos and somehow recognizing that research isn't as neat as basic handoff to applied. So certainly some dynamism there.
And I think also there's an issue that there is a lot of constraints that go on to how DOE spends its money. When Congress does authorize funding, it often does so with very specific bins of money, and then it's not possible to really exchange funds between different topics. So even if one topic proves vastly productive and another less, you can't move the funds between them. And so figuring out how to recognize that issue, and I can understand that the authorizers want to make sure money gets spent responsibly, but one would like to see some happy medium.
Any other questions? We got a gentleman here. Bill?
Just a quick question. As a test project, what if you wanted to create net power and have the government's fingerprints all over it and claim it as a success of the government? What structures would you put in place? What would have been the process that would have happened to allow that to happen?
Well, for me, I think the most successful thing would have been, and probably was, that the government put a lot of investment into some of the fundamental properties, like understanding the properties of supercritical CO2, developing the materials that can handle high-pressure vessels and high-temperature processes, maybe under some of the systems engineering that has to do with fossil processing, and then had the good sense to work with the private sector and push those technologies out so that when they're all ready to come together, the private sector can come in and pick it up. I really actually believe that the private sector does a much better job when it finally comes to the point of driving something forward into commercialization, because they have to make those choices that we've been hearing about. Is the infrastructure there? Is the market there? Is the transport that I need there? And so having the private sector, who has to be intensely involved in evaluating all those factors that makes a technology work or not work, I think is really important. So I'd like to see the really great interface where the government isn't going to claim success for net power, but is just going to be very happy that they put in place the infrastructure and the initial push that made it possible for the private sector investors, as you have done, to pull this knowledge together and do something truly amazing, which I think net power is.
Does that answer your question, Bill?
Does it? Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, and let me clarify. I don't know if I understand your question correctly. I don't know that anybody up here is advocating for, directed research from, cradle to grave.
Nope.
From the federal government. I don't think that in any way should be the takeaway from this whatsoever. I think, at least in my own words, and you give it your own,
Yeah.
I think there's my experience of being a DOE, it's an incredibly siloed organization, and there's not a lot of collaboration across those silos, and yet any one of us could pick probably 6 to 10 topic areas where we know if we were to really focus resources and work across, the Office of Electricity and the Office of Fossil Energy and the Office of EERE and even the basic energy sciences, that you could actually have a tremendous impact at speed and scale in our lifetime.
Yeah. I think that having a good interface to the private sector, that the government should be an enabler, put in place the enabling activities that the private sector can't do. And I'm not worried about the government crowding out private sector investment, because there's a huge amount that is just not possible for the private sector to do if it's too long stage and uncertain in terms of return investment. So I think that the government has a real role in enabling the technologies to the extent that it's possible to do it with foresight, in a way that then has got a large chance of enabling the private sector to drive success.
I have a question here on the front row.
Yeah.
Our friend from CRS.
Thank you. I feel like the implication of what we've been talking about is mostly hardware, but every once in a while human capital issues have popped up in the discussion, and I'm just wondering whether there are issues that we should be aware of or thinking about. I noted that Dr. Lee mentioned how important the federal research was for workforce development for the biomed companies, and I'm wondering whether there are, maybe in terms of enabling or the private sector interface or the entrepreneurialism for early stage technologies, but do any of you have any comments about workforce, what's going right or what the needs are?
Well, I think it's the common thread of what makes people kind of stumps people, right? It's like, I have all these great ideas for how to build a better, company, but if the pipeline of people isn't there, then I'm not going to be able to do it. And, I think when you look at, just to take one example, when you look at industry research at universities and people say, how do we get more of that? Then you dig into the motivations of why are big corporate entities funding universities? It's because of the people. It's a recruitment tool. That's fine, but what I worry about is, we touched on it earlier, is not recruiting people into more entrepreneurial endeavors. I don't have a good answer for how to do that. I mentioned a couple kind of experiments underway, but if that's the one I can point to, right, is big corporates, justifiably looking to draw great talent into their companies, where are the disruptors going to go? It's a very hard question. But like I said, the only thing that I have ever seen, I think most would agree, power a company to success is a team. And someone who's going to kind of push open the universe in a way that no one thinks is possible. So we need to be training scientists to think about disrupting on that vector as part of their role as a scientist, and we don't do that very often.
Yeah, Varun?
I'll just rephrase what Danielle Lee said, which I think was a really useful framework, which is the thing that we in the academia produce are knowledge, represented as publications, but the focus is on knowledge, not on publications, I think, and then the skilled, trained manpower, our graduates, our postdocs, and so on. But then the products that the governments typically care about are the products and the services, and there is a lot of need to bridge that. But the main point to your question is, if we are going to have more innovation, if we are going to take them in a more disciplined way through the whole process and have more of those actually be at scale, we need, the obvious answer is, we need more trained, skilled people in this domain. Goes back to this cycle. We have not talked what the curricular training implications are, but that's going to be part of the story as well.
So we just have 2 minutes, so we have time for at least one more question, or I've got one if no one has one. Seeing no hands. Oh, I've got a hand over here.
Hi, it's for Johanna. Does your fund invest in software companies as well as hardware companies? And can you just talk a little bit about, everything is data today, and I'm an old-fashioned guy, and I still like, hardware. But to me, I think we really have to sort of wrap our minds around how data is going to drive innovation, and I haven't heard much of that today. And I'd be curious, and Anel, on your experience at ARPA-E as well, and so on and so forth.
So we do not fund software companies, and the reason we don't has nothing to do. It has nothing to do with a statement about software isn't important. I think software, data analytics can be tremendously impactful, and we've probably only started scratching the surface in terms of decarbonization. Our thinking is that type of company is a relatively good fit for venture. And so the best of those companies will be funded by traditional venture capital. However, the hard manufacturing-based hardware innovations that are a fundamental mismatch in terms of risk and return from a venture perspective are the ones that will not be funded. And what I know for sure is that we can't get all the way to a deeply decarbonized world with software alone. And so we worry about the whole set of technologies that is a misfit for venture capital. And we say we're a fundamentally different type of capital that can take really risky bets early on, no specific payback expectation, and we're impact focused first. That's a very special and unique thing. So we're going to train it on these companies that will not otherwise be funded. There is, yes. Everything that we fund is driven by a thesis around very significant greenhouse gas emissions reduction.
So with that, we're out of time, and your question actually saved them because my last question to them, I was going to ask them to theoretically join the Trump administration and for a moment give us one thing that you would do in the Trump administration in the next 2 years to actually accelerate commercialization. But so if you're interested in that answer, find them afterwards. Our next speaker is going to come right up, and we're going to shuffle ourselves off.
Okay.
So Jim Connaughton is going to come up. They're going to bring up a podium. Please help me in thanking our panel.